America's schools appear to be another front in our nation's ever-growing culture war. Recently, parents have pummeled school boards due to their decisions over masking during the COVID pandemic, and more recently, other troubling skirmishes have erupted over books found in school libraries and those used to teach certain content that parents say has no place in the curriculum. In Tennessee, parents successfully led the charge to have the Pulitzer Prize-winning graphic novel Mouse banned from the 8th grade curriculum. The book uses mice and cats to depict Jews and Nazis as it explains the Holocaust. Other efforts to ban reading materials have occurred in Oklahoma, Texas, here in Waynesville, North Carolina, and in several other places around the country. In fact, parental efforts to remove the book The Girl Who Fell from the Sky from the 9th grade reading list in Mecklenburg County here in Charlotte were featured in a recent report on WCCB TV.
I'm here tonight to ask how and why the decision was made and who made the decision to make The Girl Who Fell from the Sky required reading in my daughter's 9th grade IB English class. Please explain to me how this is not considered pornographic material being forced upon 9th grade students in our school system.
The book allegedly contains incidents of rape and has been required reading for some 9th graders at CMS. Attempts at controlling the curriculum and banning books from school libraries is not new. It seems to come in waves, and we appear to be riding one right now. But why? What's driving the current movement? Is the pendulum swinging in a far more conservative direction, or is this a well-needed course correction? Helping us find our way through these and other questions is Summer Lopez. She is Senior Director of Free Expression Programs for PEN America. Founded in 1922, PEN America's mission is to, quote, unite writers and their allies to celebrate creative expression and defend the liberties that make it possible. Welcome to the program. Good morning.
Thank you so much.
And Dr. Shireen Campbell is here. She is a professor of English and Writing Center Director, as well as acting chair of educational studies at Davidson College. Good morning to you. Welcome.
Good morning.
And let me begin with you, Dr. Campbell. As I said in the very beginning, the push to remove reading materials from libraries and the curricula seems to come in periodic waves. What's driving this current movement, and is what we are witnessing right now an organic movement resulting from all the angst in our society over politics and COVID, et cetera, or is this part of a concerted effort to make America great again, meaning going back in time to where we didn't talk about these things?
Well, the American Library Association last fall put out a statement about what they documented as a sudden and alarming increase in censorship or in complaints about books, I should say. 120 of those instances within about a 3-month span that they had to get involved in. And these overwhelmingly were focused on books that featured experiences of marginalized groups in our society, people of color, LGBTQ individuals, et cetera. And so the most recent wave seems to be coming from, I would say, more conservative impulses to control reading content within schools. But that's one example. Certainly complaints about reading material can come from all perspectives, not simply from the right. So I can't speak to the broader cultural trends that it reflects, but certainly this moment seems to be connected to this idea of taking back power from those people, quote unquote.
Summer, we always want to encourage parents to take an active interest in their child's education, and they certainly have a right to raise concerns that they feel are legitimate about what their children are being taught. We don't want to get in the way of that. And both liberal and conservative parents share those concerns, maybe on different sides of the topic. But it appears, at least to me, and maybe I'm wrong, correct me if I am wrong, that most often these efforts to want to control what is taught by banning books from libraries or banning books from being discussed in classrooms comes most often from the conservative side of the aisle. Would I be wrong in that assessment?
I don't think you'd be wrong. It certainly doesn't only come from that direction. As Shireen said, we do see efforts from the left at times. to suggest that books should be pulled. But right now, what we're seeing is a very concerted and very deliberate effort coming primarily from the right. And, it is taking place against this broader landscape of sort of an attempt to control what can be discussed and what can be taught in America's educational institutions. So, in addition to the upswing in book bans that we've seen over the past year, we've also seen the introduction of legislation around the country to control what can be taught in schools and universities, and to sort of under the guise of countering critical race theory, to essentially ban the discussion of things that are considered divisive topics in schools and even in colleges around the country. And so, PEN America has been, kind of speaking out about that since early last year. We put out a report last fall that documented about 50 of those bills that had been introduced starting in January of 2021. The current count is over 155. And so, large majority of those just in the past few months. So we're really seeing this sort of very broad attempt to control what students are learning, to control what the conversation is in classrooms and at both the high school or at the K through 12 and the university level.
Maureen Campbell.
Yes, Summer, I was thinking about, were you referring to, I believe it's Oklahoma, where there was the legislation that would forbid institutions of higher learning from having as part of a required curriculum in a major, a course that focused on issues of diversity, if it weren't perceived as germane to that specific major.
Yes, there are a wide range of these bills across the country, yes.
Well, let me ask about that, because as much as free speech advocates are troubled by any attempt to ban books from libraries or to ban discussions, particularly at the higher education level, where discussion is part of the educational process, it would seem to me, a part of teaching people how to critically think. Is some of the pushback that we're witnessing right now, Dr. Campbell, is it, or what we've witnessed in the past, is it now or has it been justifiable? Is it a need to check overzealous moves that expand reading materials beyond age appropriateness, or is it pure politics?
I guess I would say that I think often the impulse to object to a book that's in a library and a curriculum comes from a place of care and concern about one's child, right? And an idea that, I don't want my child exposed to X. But it also reflects a misunderstanding often of the work that books do in an educational system. If I'm including a book in my class, I'm including the book because it exemplifies strong literary techniques and it provides content which students should find engaging and also complex, and we can develop problem-solving skills and communication skills. That being said, it doesn't mean I am teaching the content of the book, right? Like the goal of the class is not to indoctrinate students into the content of the book. The book is an example of literary strategies, of challenging situations that an adolescent might encounter, and it's intended to be content that students will find interesting and therefore they'll read it.
You may not have this problem at Davidson. I don't know how it may differ from more public universities, but in a culture that spends most of its time on screens as opposed to reading literature, and I don't mean romance novels, I mean literature, is it difficult to understand what you just talked about, the concept of using a book not to indoctrinate, but to use it as an example of what you're trying to teach, whether it's a good example or a bad one?
It would seem so. Often complaints hinge on the idea that the assumption is you are teaching my child, if a character in a book does X, that X is a good thing to do, right? You can think about a children's book like Captain Underpants, in which, young boys in elementary school have a principal they don't respect very much, and he winds up somehow transforming into a superhero, right? And it's not great literature, but it gets boys who quit reading by middle school to keep reading. And so it's more important that people read than we impose ideals upon what is appropriate to read.
Summer.
I mean, I think the other piece of this, we saw this very much with the example of Mouse that you gave, right? The concern was the content was disturbing. Well, yes, of course it's disturbing. It's about the Holocaust. That's the point, right? The point is to have a conversation about history and to understand what has happened and to learn from that. And I think, that is a source of tension right now, and sort of how we talk about history is always a source of tension, but that's really, I think, part of the concern. And I think what we are seeing right now is this real sort of backlash against attempts to bring a more diverse and inclusive set of voices and stories into the curriculum and to diversify the books that are on the shelves. And, in some cases, we're seeing organizations essentially take recommended lists of diverse children's literature and use that as the list that they recommend parents be challenging. So I think it's pretty direct what we're seeing happening right now and the particular stories that are being targeted.
For those people who are not familiar with Mouse, it's a graphic novel, meaning that it is drawn like a comic strip or a comic book. And it's based on the author, Art Spiegelman's parents' story of surviving the Auschwitz concentration camp. And it was, he says, the author says, never intended for children, but it does explain the Nazis' attempts to exterminate the Jews to young people in a format that they're already accustomed to consuming. And since its release in 1980, it's been included in some school curricula. But even Art Spiegelman, the author, initially had his doubts about this approach.
As you said, this has been used in schools for a very long time, usually from middle school on up. And I used to have my doubts, is this all right? Am I robbing children of their childhood? Because the book was never made specifically as a young adult or child's book. I have now learned over the last, 30 to 40 years, that there are really intelligent children and really stupid adults.
So, there are specific incidents in this book to which some parents object, including nudity, although the nudity is depicted as mouse nudity. It is not human nudity. This speaks to a larger question, I guess, of trying to protect children by not giving them a full picture of the world. How do we balance expanding a child's knowledge against destroying their innocence?
Nobody would say that every book is appropriate for every age group, right? But, these are decisions that educators make as professionals, that teachers and librarians assess what literature is appropriate for what age group, and then they teach that to students. I think we have to really remember the role of educators in this process and to help students, understand what they're reading, as Shireen said, not in a way of indoctrinating them, but to analyze the reading that they're consuming, to be critical thinkers, to be good citizens. That's part of what public education is about, and that requires helping them to understand both the world as it is, the history that we still reckon with, its implications, and the power of stories is also to help us envision the world as it could be. And I think that's a real it's a real danger to take that away from children.
Dr. Campbell, I got less than 30 seconds.
Another good example is swear words, which will get you pulled very fast. Children learn curse words generally by age 3 or 4, and then they learn when and how to use them. Books don't do that to you.
Let's come back to that, because that is a touchstone for a lot of parents, curse words in these books. We'll do that when we come back at Charlotte Talks on WFAE. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and the Original Mattress Factory, hand-built mattresses and box springs in Charlotte and sold directly to the customer at showrooms throughout the region. More information at originalmattress.com. And Tyndall Subaru, Gastonia, featuring the new 2022 Subaru Ascent with performance technology and design updates throughout. Details at tyndallsubaru.com and on Facebook at Tyndall Subaru. Well, tomorrow is the day a 3-judge panel is set to announce their decision on the redrawn congressional and legislative voting maps in North Carolina. After months of political jockeying and 2 court cases, the legislature has submitted new maps and the court will accept them or reject them. So we look at how these new maps compare with the originals and how the court's decision, whatever it may be tomorrow, could reshape our politics. And that is tomorrow at 9 on this program.
It's your world. We help you explore it.
In Honduras today, the man who was president until just a few weeks ago will now face a federal judge.
It's your community. We help you understand it.
Washington says local COVID-19 trends are continuing to go in the right direction and says the county needs to plan for dealing with the virus long term.
WFAE's Morning Edition is an essential way to start your day and stay connected to your world. Weekday mornings from 5 to 9 on 90.7 WFAE.
It's Charlotte Talks on listener funded 90.7 WFAE and 90.3 WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. We're talking about skirmishes around the country over books being in school libraries and books being included in curricula that some parents find objectionable. And we're talking about that with Summer Lopez, the Senior Director of the Free Expression Programs at Penn America, and Dr. Shireen Campbell, who's a professor of English and Writing Center Director and acting chair of educational studies at Davidson College. And just prior to the break, curse words came into the conversation. And I had asked the question, Dr. Campbell, about how you balance protecting the innocence of children with giving them a fuller picture of the world as it truly exists. And one of the things in that world are curse words, which, as you just said, many children start hearing and using at age 3. I wonder where they get those words at age 3. Certainly not from books. So talk to me about how that works, because that's often something that parents point to in these books. They don't want their children exposed to those words.
Yeah, so psychological research shows that by ages 3 and 4, generally children have started acquiring the words of power that they hear adults yell in times of stress or anger, right? And they tune in to those moments. And by kindergarten, they often have realized through trial and error that adults don't like it when they use those words. And then they start self-censoring and not using them. So I think of profanity, which was brought up in the case of Mouse. There were apparently 8 instances of a profane word used in a long graphic novel about the Holocaust. That doesn't strike me as inordinate. It came up in the Waynesville, North Carolina case involving Dear Martin. And the plain truth is that, the impulse to protect your child from a complicated world is certainly one we understand, and wanting to maintain innocence. It's also true that research into behavior shows that mass media, familial exposure, friend behavior, those are the things that really influence behavior much more than books. I would love it if people read books and were influenced by them. I don't, that's,
Summer, I think it was you that earlier in our conversation brought up some statistics from the American Library Association. They say that there were 300 book challenges in the fall of 2021. That's an uptick from recent years. The New York Times reported that, quote, parents, activists, school board officials, and lawmakers around the country are challenging books at a pace not seen in decades. But we're talking about 300 book challenges among about 99,000 public K through 12 schools in this country. That is a tiny fraction. How concerned then should this make us?
Well, it's important to remember, first of all, it can be hard to collect these numbers, right? These things happen at very local levels. I would say any numbers that are put out should be considered a minimum. But also each of those challenges can involve many books, right? In one case in Texas, we've seen a state lawmaker who put out a list of 850 books that he wanted schools to report on whether or not they had those books in stock. He didn't really say anything about what the consequences would be, what the next steps would be. But it didn't really matter. Several school districts responded of their own accord by pulling hundreds of books off of shelves, hundreds of titles. Even those titles could be many copies. So, the number of actual books being impacted is quite significant. And what we're seeing now as an increasing trend is actual, as I think was mentioned earlier, essentially book ban legislation that would ban materials containing content particularly related to LGBTQ content. We've seen this now in a number of states. There is a bill that would make it a Class B misdemeanor for a teacher or a librarian to provide any material that included reference to homosexuality. I believe that's in Oklahoma. And so, that has the potential to have a very broad effect in terms of what books are available and what people are able to teach.
Dr. Campbell.
Well, and when there is a case like this, it has a spillover effect into, as Summer said, other area schools, other area libraries. New teachers will be counseled not to include potentially controversial content. Libraries with limited budgets for purchases will know about these cases, and it might have a chilling effect on what they purchase and make available to the public. Libraries also experience people going into them, checking out books that they have been told or deem are objectionable and deliberately not returning them. So then the book is somehow still taken out of circulation.
It's a really important point to remember that when censorship occurs, the actual censorship and the thing being censored is only the piece that we see, right? There's a broader chilling effect that occurs. There's also the potential that certain stories don't get told. If you were a YA, a young adult author right now, considering what to write about and knowing that, if you touched on certain topics or introduced certain characters, your book might never see the light of day, that it might not reach students at all, that you might lose out on a lot of potential opportunities, you might make different decisions about what to write. So, we also don't know about what stories might not even be told as a result of this trend.
As you pointed out, Dr. Campbell, in many instances, teachers who assign books as part of curricula aren't necessarily assigning those books because they are teaching the lesson that you're talking about, or you're not telling that you're not saying to the student, this is where the way you should think. It's to expose them to an idea about which discussion will ensue for evaluation. And Jeffrey Sachs, a professor who tracks free speech in education, believes that the current movement is an attempt to constrain expression. He says it is not about discussion or discussing ideas objectively. It's about not discussing them at all. So talk about the intersection of free speech rights and education. Do the free speech rights stop at the schoolhouse door?
I would passionately argue they should not. I think about this with regard to the increase in anxiety about books that show difficult realities of life, right? And here I think young adult literature is a good case in point. Young adult novels often include teenagers struggling in a world they don't understand and making, teenagers make bad decisions as well as good. And I have a colleague who is a school administrator, and she says that when parents come in concerned about a book that their child has been exposed to, say in the 10th grade, that she will suggest, look, don't you think it's better that they have a chance to talk about the implications of this kind of decision-making using a book in a classroom context than encountering such a situation outside of school without ever having thought about it or troubled through it. And that often parents, when sort of acknowledging that reality, will say, oh, I hadn't thought about it that way. But it's not, not having that conversation doesn't mean those challenges don't exist, right? And that school can provide a structured environment in which to have the conversation, which is infinitely preferable to no conversation and an encounter without any skill set in order to address what situation you're facing.
Summer Lopez.
All of that I very much agree with, and I also think the First Amendment protects not just our right to free speech, but our right to receive information, and children are protected by the First Amendment as well. And I think, there is legal precedent for the protection of First Amendment rights for students as well. And there is.
But
Yep.
parents have rights too. So talk about the intersection of parental rights and free speech rights when it comes to the schoolhouse.
Right. Well, I think one of the important distinctions here is that, if a parent has a concern about their child and a book that their child is reading, it's almost always the case that they can have a conversation with the teacher, with the school, and find some sort of accommodation or work through that concern. What we're seeing right now is parents imposing their concern on all the other parents and all the other children. And that is infringing on those other parents' rights as well. We are seeing these bills introduced about parents' rights, but which parents? What about the parent who is LGBTQ themselves and wants their child to read those books and have access to those stories, or who wants their child to have an understanding of people who are different from them as well? So, I think it's not to discredit the concerns that parents may have, but what we're seeing right now is a much broader chilling on the rights of students and other parents as well.
Anecdotally, it is sometimes, I think it's most people's impression that these pushes toward banning books, et cetera, come from the right, not from the left. But the left, people on the left have certainly been engaging in very recent years in something called cancel culture, banning expression that offends anybody or has the potential of offending anybody, or which can be viewed as a microaggression against a person or a group of people. And this has received pushback from people both on the right and on the left. In one school district in Virginia last year, they stopped using Dr. Seuss and his book as part of the emphasis of Read Across America, which is a day historically connected to Dr. Seuss, because of a contingent of citizens who cited research on racial undertones in Geisler's work, Dr. Seuss's work. Brian Kilmeade is one of the hosts of Fox and Friends on Fox News, and he called this an example of cancel culture.
And we're going to let one group decide that it's not worthy of our eyes and our kids? That's a travesty. Dr. Seuss should not be canceled in your home. Let this stay in that one county. And if you want that, if you don't want to read Dr. Seuss, go to that county.
So, Summer, is he right about this being cancel culture, or is his prescription to correct the problem the right way to go?
Well, I would hope he would apply what he just said to any other books as well that we are seeing attacked right now. I think we have to push back against book bans of all kinds, right? It is problematic if you're being hypocritical about it. And PEN America has spoken out against attempts to pull Huckleberry Finn and To Kill a Mockingbird from shelves as well. These are also books that we can teach, right? That we don't have to be sort of taken at face value without a conversation, but banning books is simply never the answer. And, I do think there's a broader concern about sort of a sort of disconnect from free speech as a value across the political spectrum right now. Absolutely. I do think that's a concern on the left as well, but there's a hierarchy of threats to free speech. And at the top of that is government attempting to dictate what content can be discussed and spoken about. And that's what we're seeing right now.
So, from an English professor's point of view, what is the correct response if you, as a parent, have strong objections to a book? And what should be the response from a teacher, particularly at the grade or high school level, who wants to prepare and should have a responsibility of preparing these young people for the world and for college in many cases? If they can't read certain books that help in that preparation, are they cheating those children out of being ready?
This has come up in a few cases that I'm familiar with from a project I used to assign in a class I taught on young adult literature. In Glenn County, Georgia, there was a character education mandate, and a school board member wanted Catcher in the Rye, the J.D. Salinger classic, pulled from the junior reading list because Holden curses a lot. And they began, and the claim was that this goes against our character education mandate. We wouldn't let students speak this way. They shouldn't read a book that includes cursing. And there was an unintended consequence in that they started then trying to ferret out all the books that would include language, which would run afoul of the character education mandate about profanity. And Shakespeare, the Bible, it was just the proliferating list of things. And they wound up deciding they wouldn't proceed with pulling of the books. Part of the reason they didn't do it is because Catcher in the Rye was at that point, I believe, on the SAT. And the outgoing chancellor of education of the state of Georgia said, look, we need people to read books, not ban them. So, that's a good example. Now, back to your question about parents. If a parent sits down with their child and looks at the upcoming semester's reading list, my children went through the Charlotte-Mecklenburg system. I would always know what they were reading. There were descriptions of what they were going to be reading. And if I had concerns about a book, there is a provision whereby I could approach the teacher in advance and request an alternative for my child. The challenge then comes if your child is reading an alternative book, but the class is reading the other book and having the conversations. Sometimes parents will argue, but my child is being excluded from those conversations. And then in that case, what they want is everyone else not to be able to read the thing they don't want their child to read. And that's where the rights of the one somehow become more important than the rights of the others, of the all. And that's problematic.
You're an English professor. Did you ever have to have that conversation with teachers of your
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Some of the efforts to control what is being taught go beyond books right now when it comes to bans on quote unquote critical race theory, something that is not taught in any school below college, law school. But nonetheless, there are misconceptions about that. And the reaction to that is putting teachers smack dab in the middle, in the awkward position of having their jobs threatened, even if they answer or try to answer a question posed by a student because they don't want to say the wrong thing. This is a free speech issue, but can it be defended as one, or Summer, do school employees have to follow the dictates of higher ups?
Well, I think, it is more complicated for teachers, right? There are, they are following a curriculum and, but I think, the real concern here is the broad language of these bills that we've seen, what we've called educational gag orders. They are extremely vaguely written. They have the potential to censor wide ranges of conversation. They could be interpreted to say, you essentially can't teach about slavery or the Holocaust. There's a bill right now that prohibits teaching about anti-Semitism. That makes teaching about the Holocaust very difficult, right? We have seen instances where, in some of the states that have passed some of these bills, parents have raised concerns about Black History Month as possibly a violation of these laws. And so, the broad chilling effect is very significant. And I think, again, we are going to see teachers steer clear of content that could, bring retribution to them, but also to their schools. In often cases, this is tied to funding. Nobody wants to be the reason that the school doesn't get funding. And so, I think the sort of messages and incentives that are being sent by these bills are extremely concerning, and particularly at the higher education level, colleges and universities, just a direct violation of academic freedom.
One of the concerns here, of course, is that teaching about certain things tends to normalize them. And that's one of the great fears. And we'll talk about that, among other things, when we come back in a moment at Charlotte Talks on WFAE. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and Tryon Medical Partners, an independent practice with physicians in 10 specialty areas providing care at locations across the Charlotte region. Tryon Medical Partners, more at tryonmed.com. Parasocial relationships are one-way connections people can have with a celebrity or online personality. And given the pandemic, a 60% uptick in our screen use moved many of our social outlets to the digital realm. One study has found that this resulted in stronger parasocial connections to compensate for the lack of real-life interactions. For the this latest installment of Extremely Online, 1A will investigate how these relationships form and their growing influence worldwide, and that is coming up in 20 minutes at 10 o'clock on 1A. We will continue our conversation about book banning and censorship in 30 seconds.
Lots of changes underway in Charlotte, and WFAE's Bizworthy segment helps keep you informed. Take the challenges with the city's 2040 comprehensive plan.
How to save Charlotte's tree canopy, parking around historic districts, short-term rentals. Some residents have complained that people are renting out Airbnbs and throwing big parties.
Catch Bizworthy every Thursday on WFAE's Morning Edition at 6:44 and 8:44. Support for Bizworthy is provided by Sharon View Federal Credit Union and our members.
It's Charlotte Talks on WFAE and WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. We're talking about book banning and censorship. And when it comes to teaching children of all levels, including the college level, by the way, with Summer Lopez, who's Senior Director of Free Expression Programs at Penn America, and Dr. Shireen Campbell, Professor of English at Davidson College. One of the concerns here by many groups and by parents is that by teaching certain lessons or using books to teach those lessons, you tend to normalize things that those parents may object to. I think, Dr. Campbell, you brought up the area of LGBTQ studies and the books that might bring in characters and depict their struggles with being LGBTQ and how that relates to society at large. And they are worried that bringing those up in a classroom will spread understanding about the struggles and therefore normalize it. So that brings up the question of how can you teach anything? Because there are characters in books who have been divorced. There are characters in books who are single parents. And that used to be abnormal. It is now normal. So how do you teach anything?
Indeed. I think about it a lot in terms of the power of a book and the assumptions about the work books do in the world, in that we do know that reading complicated narratives that involve coming to understand other people's perspectives makes us not necessarily more empathetic or sympathetic, but at least better able to understand other people's perspectives. And so if you don't want your child understanding what it is like to be multiracial or LGBT, or, like if you don't want your child to understand the other, you might object to that content. This comes up in the last 10 years with cases featuring Muslim characters as one example. We had Marjane Satrapi, author of Persepolis, at Davidson a few years ago. And that book has been objected to, quote, because why should my kid learn about Muslims, end quote. And so that is a tension, right? Books do expose you to the lives of people who aren't you and suggest that you should try to understand other people, right? That being human means understanding others. So I don't have a solution. I do think that is one of the challenges of the current moment.
It may be that conservatives most often object to LGBTQ books being taught or characters being discussed or issues being discussed or even Muslim issues being discussed. But it is on the left, too, that certain issues come up. For instance, Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird has been criticized, and the use of that book in the curricula has been criticized by people on the left because of racial slurs in that book and because a white savior character is featured in that. Liberals have challenged John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men because of the same thing and because of racial stereotypes being written in that book. Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn has come under similar challenges. Summer, how do you this is all part of the same ball of wax, it seems to me. So how do you approach this? What is the answer? We keep having the same conversations over and over about different sides of the aisle, but nonetheless the same thing.
Well, I think, to some extent, none of this is to say that schools and educators can't also, reassess the curriculum, right? And go through a regular process of, deciding what they think is the most effective to teach, what is the most effective story to tell to teach a certain lesson, to spark a certain conversation. That's something we have to trust educators to do. And that's a process that they will go through. And I think decisions that get made through that process are not the same type of concern, right? So if there, and again, as we said, a lot of this is backlash to those efforts to diversify the curriculum, to bring in new voices and new stories. I think what's problematic is when we see changes made in result of political pressure to sort of, outcry or sense that a certain idea is dangerous, right? I think that's worrisome. I think all of these books contain content that can be the important basis for a classroom conversation. Now, not every teacher may choose to teach every one of the books, or every school might not choose to include it on their curriculum, but I don't think there's any reason to bar the teaching of these books, to prohibit them from being even, part of the conversation or there being access to them.
Dr. Campbell.
Yeah, in the case of To Kill a Mockingbird and Huckleberry Finn both, I've had students who looked at specific instances in which those cases were contested. And occasionally the challenge is that the students there was no conversation in advance about the fact that this is a book which includes explicitly racist language and attitudes. And we are not reading it because we endorse these attitudes. We are reading it for other reasons. And, here's how we will handle those scenes. If you're a parent of a child and your child is one of the few students of color in a school district, and you're reading a novel which features racist language, and the teacher calls on you to read a passage using that racist language, that's a bad pedagogic decision. That is not, that is not in the service of having a good discussion about the book. So there's an important aspect of this which relates to teacher preparation and consciousness about the impact of being in a classroom.
Well, isn't the argument here that, yes, the N-word in a book or racial stereotypes in a book are offensive to modern sensibilities, one would hope, but it's not about the N-word being used. It is about the mistakes that were made in the past that allowed that word to be used without anybody even flinching. And we do flinch now. And isn't that part of the educational process?
Precisely.
Okay. All right. Adam Latz, who is an historian who studies the history of American education, says that the current trend of banning books is rooted in a backlash against, quote, a specific kind of content seen as teaching children, especially white children, that there is something wrong with America. And this is not, he says, the first time that this has happened. It happened during Depression era America, in where class consciousness resulted in an examination of whether or not this, in fact, was a land of opportunity. And the mere questioning of that trope was considered to be un-American. Is this nation unique in having arguments over the discussion of literature in an educational setting that depicts the country in which people are living as not totally wonderful?
I would assume not. Summer, what would you say?
I mean, contestations over history are everywhere, right? I mean, let's think about what we just heard Vladimir Putin say yesterday about Ukraine's history, right? I mean, part of the reason that we really worry about this trend of book banning is that it's an authoritarian tactic, right? To control what people can think, to control the ideas that people have access to sort of dictate a single narrative about history is very much something we see in authoritarian countries all over the world. That's why PEN America works to defend writers who are under attack around the world, because of the power of stories to sort of challenge, authoritarian attempts to dictate a single story themselves, and to control how people are able to think and engage with their history. I think we need to shift our thinking a little bit to recognize that what we should value is the fact that we have the freedom to discuss our history in a robust way, to debate how we should think about it and what that really means for us today. That's the freedom of being in a democracy, and that's what we should really be valuing and reinforcing.
Part of the argument today is what is being taught and erasing or not bringing up part of the things about our history or our even current contemporary society that we find uncomfortable. Jerry Kraft is a children's author who happens to be African American, and he writes about Black children struggling to fit in, particularly in areas where they are the odd man out in terms of being the only Black person, for instance, in a classroom. And in his book, New Kid was recently accused of teaching critical race theory, which it does not, and was banned in Texas. That ban has since been lifted, but in the interim, Kraft told NBC News that being banned did not hurt him or his books.
I think it probably doubled the amount of readers because I have gotten so many emails almost every day talking about that they had never heard of me, but now when they realized it, but what's so funny is some people are actually disappointed. One person tweeted, he says, oh, I picked up this book and I was expecting, anti-police and anti-this and anti-that. And it was a loving mom and dad with their kid and the grandfather, and there's friends and there's all that. He said, I love the book, but I was disappointed because I was waiting for all this other stuff.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but he is not the exception. He is the rule. Doesn't banning books, Summer, generally increase interest in the books and the topics being banned?
It definitely can, but I don't think we should sort of comfort ourselves with this notion. I think it's usually the case for books that are better known to begin with, right? Mouse is a great example. But for books that aren't already and authors who aren't already household names, it can actually be very detrimental, right? We are talking about a reduction and potentially longer term, especially a reduction in demand for their book, and absence of opportunities to do things like go and speak at schools, which can be sources of income for authors. And again, we kind of don't know what books might never get written. But I think the other important thing is that, even if you and I can go out and buy the banned book and feel good about ourselves, that doesn't mean that the student who actually really needed that book still has access to it, right? And I think that, to your point earlier about normalization, well, for a student who is struggling with their own sexuality, or for a student who finds themselves the only child of color or the only immigrant in their community, these books can be life-changing to see themselves in that story. They can be life-saving in many cases. And so, I think the danger of them being removed is, it's easy to think, well, maybe it's still selling well, but the people who really need access are still the ones suffering.
And Dr. Campbell, you have written that the attempt to censor books is as old as books themselves. And you say that they are consistently, genuinely counterproductive. Talk about that.
Well, I mean, even at the base level of literacy, if, generally speaking, we know that more often for boys than girls by middle school, they quit reading. As and you have an upcoming program about parasocial connections, like the pandemic strengthening our online engagement. People read less and less. And we know that if you don't develop a habit as a reader early, that has profound implications for your life. The prison industry, one of the metrics they look at to determine where they might build prisons in the future is literacy rates at age 10 and 11 in a community. And so just trying to prevent people from reading, period, has a bad impact on our society. It is not, this is not the way, this is just not productive.
Aren't all of these attempts today, yesterday, tomorrow to ban books and to prohibit certain things being discussed in the classroom, aren't they all about the same thing? Controlling access to knowledge, to what is being taught, to what is being learned, and who gets to tell the story, Dr. Campbell.
Yes, and ultimately the collision between, does literature do the work of showing you ideals, or does literature do the work of plunging you into different realistic situations? And the tension is, whose ideals, right? Whose ideals should we promote? Do we promote classic literature from 100 years ago, which shows ideals which included some people and excluded others? And how do you talk about that?
Summer, we've been through this before, as I said, and these attempts to ban and quell discussion seem to come in waves, and then they disappear, and then they come back later on. Have we learned anything from past attempts to quell discussion and to ban books that we can apply today and in the future? Has anything worked, or does it just peter out because there's a lack of interest because it's a tiny number of people who try to do these things?
Well, I think what's important is that, I think what we're seeing a lot of right now is a small number of people having an outsized impact. And so, what I will say I think works, and what I would ask people to do if they are concerned about this, is to speak up. School boards are under a lot of pressure right now, and they're hearing from the loudest people and they're reacting to that. But they need to hear from parents who oppose book bans, who want their children to have access to a diverse set of literature and stories. I think representatives need to hear from people about, what they want to see and what they have concerns about. And I think that this, reminding people that they represent a diverse population as well, that, just the squeakiest wheel can't sort of determine reality for everybody else. So I really would advise people to, speak up, raise your concerns, talk to your schools, and make your voices heard as well.
And doctor, this isn't just necessarily about books or the topics discussed in these books. It's about the topics in those books making the reader, children, uncomfortable, or making them feel guilty about themselves or their race or whatever it may be. How should we feel about that? And in 40 seconds, how do we overcome those fears?
I've never read a book that I thought was intended to make me feel guilty or apologetic for my class or race or situation in life. I think there's ample, there are ample experiences in our lives which can point to broader responsibility for social inequality as one example. That's not really a 40-second soundbite, Mike. I apologize, but yeah.
We'll have to leave it at that because I hear the music. That means only one thing. The clock is ticking to the end. Dr. Shireen Campbell, you get the last word. Professor of English, Writing Center Director, and Acting Chair of Educational Studies at Davidson College. And Summer Lopez, Senior Director of the Free Expression Programs at Penn America. Thank you both for the hour.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Charlotte Talks with Mike Collins is a production of 90.7 WFAE.